At 10:02, we are in session for this special meeting, and I will ask the city manager to take it from here.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, Mayor and Council, thanks for your attendance and convening your monthly workshop. This is, I know, a third meeting for the month, but this is a great time to just kind of really have some thorough discussion about particular issues. And so, on today's agenda, it's about the possible creation of a downtown tax increment reinvestment zone. So this is really a Kerrville 2050 early action item that began with a study even before Kerrville 2050 was adopted. And you have had this on your agenda previously to discuss potential boundaries of what that might look like. We also had a very, a public meeting at the Callow Center with the public attending to hear more about what is a tax increment reinvestment zone and how does it work and so on and so forth. So this is going to be an opportunity to take more of a deep dive into what it is, how it's created, what we're looking at for this particular TIRZ, and then also what the next steps might be. So at the end of this, we'd hope to have some clear direction about are we proceeding or not, because it is scheduled for your meeting in September to begin the process. David Pettit and his associate Natalie are here today to make that presentation. They want to get through their whole presentation. There's a lot of information to present here. We want to make sure we get through it and then leave plenty of time for your questions at the end if you want to make notations on the hard copy in front of you as we move along. So with that, I want to go ahead and have David come to the podium and begin the presentation.
Well, Mark, Mayor, members of council, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and present a workshop to you regarding tax increment financing. Mayor, I took your word at the last meeting that you wanted to know all the ins and outs of TIF before we left here. Hopefully that won't take us till 5 p.m. Because we do have a flight to catch, but we will try to be as efficient and thorough with your time. And this is not our first rodeo. We've done over 100 TIFs. My background is in public administration, and then I've been in the TIF business for about 25 years. And my associate Natalie Moore, I just hired from the city of Fort Worth, and she's an Aggie, so don't hold that against her. And,
it will not be held against her in this county.
And she also has a master's from TCU, and but she worked for the city of Fort Worth managing their TIFs and their PIDs, so she has a lot of on the boots on the ground experience with regards to TIFs. And so with that, I'm just going to begin with our overall PowerPoint. Our purpose is to discuss the concept of tax increment financing, the key elements of TIF agreements, key stages for facilitating new investment, give you a couple case studies, tasks necessary to create a TIRZ, and answer any questions. So these are your basic definitions. Tax increment financing is a tool that incentivizes economic development within a tax increment reinvestment zone. So we're using two terms there, TIF and TIRZ. So one's a tool and one's a zone. So we'll use those interchangeably a lot. And there's really no difference. One's a tool and one is simply the zone. It's governed by the tax code, chapter 311. According to the state database through the comptroller's office, there is 313 TIRZ districts in the state of Texas. We have worked on approximately a third of those, if not more. Cities alone or in partnership with other taxing jurisdictions can use this tool to pay for infrastructure improvements in the zone, so it will attract new development, facilitate investment, and bring excitement and energy to a designated area. Taxing entities contribute ad valorem taxes received from incremental value increases in the property within the TIRZ, and the TIRZ can pay for cost of public works, public improvements, economic development programs, we'll talk about that here in a minute, and other projects benefiting the zone. This is an academic chart, and if I can just basically throw it to the side for just a minute. Imagine you just create a zone, and that zone, you set a boundary, and you say, we're comfortable collecting all the revenue that we're currently getting. But if any new development occurs, we're going to put all or a portion of that increment revenue into a fund. That's what a TIF is for a certain amount of time. And so over that period of time, I like to tell the story of a lot of people, particularly in downtown Fort Worth, they were looking at doing some investments in downtown, and all the city investment was going to the north and south. And some of the stakeholders downtown said, when's the last time the city spent money downtown? And they said, well, that was 1972 when they last used a CIP program downtown. They said, if we're going to make investments, we'd like to capture some of that money and make sure it goes to our community. And a TIF is a great mechanism to do that. And you'll see that throughout some of our examples. TIRZ revenues, these are the basics. If we don't get these, we don't understand the very basics of TIRZ and what it takes. You can only create TIRZ revenues through new construction or annual appreciation of property. So as your property grows, I know we have the state legislature trying to cap what that growth rate is. I know I'm seeing my tax bill grow every year, even though taxes stay the same. But we do have growth. Those are the two basic ways. So new construction or annual appreciation of that property are the way that you generate increment above that base. So that's very important to know as well. Thought this was a good little diagram that showed the cycle of TIRZ revenues. That you create the boundary, you have the new development or increase in property values, that creates TIRZ increment, and therefore then you use that money for TIRZ improvements. So I'm going into the simplest. We're going to get into some finite detail, so I'm going high to low, so don't worry about this. It's not going to be at this level the entire time. Why create a TIRZ? I think we mentioned this before when we presented. It's a private development activity is expected to occur within a designated area. It benefits an area at large. Oh, next slide, sorry. Somebody was whispering over here.
Yeah.
Next slide, yeah. Benefits an area at large rather than being project specific. Provides a funding source without impacting the current amount of general fund revenues for each participating taxing jurisdiction. So basically you're collecting, once you create that zone, you're collecting the same amount of revenue that you were before. So you're just dedicating, once again, that increment. You have the ability to leverage revenues from taxable properties within the TIRZ to generate a larger increment. It helps attract potential developers and investors into an area that otherwise might not occur, and demonstrates a commitment to creating a sense of place and identity. We do have tools that will help with specific site development, but that does not necessarily benefit the area at large. So that's why the TIF is often the preferred method for delivery of these type of incentives. Another thing is investors are drawn to areas that have a well thought out plan. This is the only math that will be done for the day. There might be a little bit more as we get later on. But let's just assume we created a boundary and its base was $200,000. The following year, the value was $300,000. So you had $100,000 worth of increment. At your current tax rate, that would generate $551 million that would go into the TIRZ. And so you could use that money to fund specific projects within that TIRZ. And this assumes just the city of Kerrville participating in a TIRZ. We do have the ability to ask the other taxing jurisdictions to participate. This is another fundamental for the TIRZ creation process is Chapter 311 of the Texas Tax Code outlines the various procedures for creating and amending a TIF. There's just two main documents, a creation ordinance and a TIF project and financing plan. And so the creation ordinance establishes 4, and I'm going to say 5 key elements. I'm adding the 5th. Boundary, term, the city's participation, you set up the TIF board, And then you have a preliminary project and financing plan. So basically, an analysis that basically says this is what we think is going to happen, the crystal ball, as I like to say, over the next 30 years. Once you've created the TIF, the final project and financing plan goes through that TIF board and then is recommended to City Council for approval by a separate ordinance. And I understand in the City of Kerrville that you require 2 readings on each ordinance, and we've incorporated that into our plan. With that, I'd like to invite Natalie up to kind of walk through the next couple of slides. Thank you.
So what I wanted to go over was some of the common questions that often arise when we have these types of discussions. This is taken mostly from the Texas Comptroller's Office, so it's something that is common questions that arise. The first one, this usually comes from citizens, is the TIF an additional tax burden? And that's something we want to address right away, that this is not an additional tax burden. This is actually just a redirection of a portion of the taxes that are collected. Which taxing units can participate in the TIF? Any taxing unit that collects ad valorem taxes from the property in the TIRZ may participate in the TIF project, but they are not obligated to do so. Those are participation agreements that are negotiated. How many board members are required for a tax increment project? For a normal TIRZ, the board of directors must consist of at least 5, but can go up to 15. Who appoints the board members? The city and the other taxing entities, participating taxing entities, can appoint the board members. So that's something to take into consideration if we were to move forward. That is something that we would have to look at. How are the project costs paid? The board of directors makes all payments for the project cost from the tax increment fund. That's the funding source comes directly from the increment that we discussed. Can a city change the boundaries of a TIRZ? Yes, but they must continue to meet the restrictions for the creation of a TIRZ, and only with the public hearing and an ordinance. So similar to the creation ordinance, you would go through that same process to amend the boundaries of the TIRZ. Can the TIRZ be terminated? Yes. A city that created a TIRZ can terminate it by again approving an ordinance that designates a termination date. Termination can also occur when all the project costs, tax increment bonds and interest on those bonds, and other obligations have been paid in full. What happens to the money that remains in the fund after a TIRZ has been terminated? So if you were to elect to terminate the TIRZ and there was still money in the fund, those funds are dispersed back to the participating taxing units in proportion to each jurisdiction's share of the total tax increments collected. I wanted to discuss some of the types of public-private partnerships. That's something that we mention quite often is a public-private partnership. So what specifically does that mean, and when are those used? One of the main ways within a TIRZ that a public partnership will come about is for infrastructure improvements. This is the use of this tool in conjunction with a plan to foster redevelopment, typically focusing on those infrastructure needs, those public works that were described earlier. Also, a public-private partnership would look like business creation and retention. This is this use of this tool to encourage the relocation or retention of targeted businesses. This is something that you would want to use in conjunction with an economic development strategy to get certain businesses, in this case, in downtown. And then, lastly, for gap financing. This is a tool so that the developer or the partner would be able to get a fair rate of return for their private investment that would otherwise not occur. This is when we're looking at the pro forma or the cash flow and we see a gap that without the use of some sort of incentive, without the public entity stepping in to form a partnership, this project would not be able to move forward. It's extremely critical. So how do we fund that gap? What does that look like? Well, the one way is to reduce the costs on the front end. The city or the participating entity or the public entity could participate by paying for some of the costs such as streetscapes, the parking garages, and other public infrastructure improvements. A second way would be to reduce expense. This is something that the development would be incurring on a yearly basis, and this is where we can do a rebate of their tax increment, offset that tax burden. And the third way is to increase their revenue. This is by doing a facade easement or lease, or to do a Program 380 grant, which we'll discuss a little bit more in detail. So what do those agreements look like once we have a partnership? What does the agreement look like? Well, we could have a development agreement, and this is where we agree to do infrastructure improvements in exchange for that private investment. That would be including, the infrastructure improvements could include roads, streetscape, water, sewer, parks. It could include environmental remediation if it's a quote-unquote dirty site, or it could be a Program 380 agreement. And then again, you could do a lease agreement, such as a parking lease or a facade lease. The TIF expenditures, using those tax increment within the TIF fund, what do you use it for? Well, you would use it for either project costs, as described in the TIF statute, Chapter 311, or activities consistent with the authority granted by the TIF statute for that Program 380 authority. So if you haven't had your coffee, we're about to read some statute, so that's fun. Project costs means the expenditures made or estimated to be made and monetary obligations incurred or estimated to be incurred by the municipality or county establishing a reinvestment zone that are listed in the project plan as costs of public works or public improvements in the zone, plus other costs incidental to those expenditures and obligations. So project costs are costs associated with the project. All that to say. Going on to read the Economic Development Program, the governing body of a municipality may establish and provide for the administration of one or more programs, including programs for making loans and grants of public money and providing personnel and services of the municipality. This is key, to promote state or local economic development and to stimulate business and commercial activity in the municipality. And that right there, to promote state or local economic development, is what we love because it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we use those funds. The test of meeting that, the decision of whether or not it meets that test is left to you, if you believe that it will stimulate the local economy. And with that, I'll let David talk about some of the key elements of the TIF agreement.
Thank you, Natalie. One of the things I want to emphasize with what Natalie just mentioned, we can pretty much with the TIF statute fund anything that's necessary to make a project happen. We can fund those public improvements, but a lot of times we've had abandoned buildings that they already have the infrastructure in place, so they need a cash infusion. Y'all are familiar, have y'all done 380s? And so Program 380 is just a local government code, Chapter 380 says you can do anything with general fund money as long as it stimulates business commercial activity within the zone, and that's a subjective finding of the city council. So we love that in the economic development world because that gives us a lot of tools to be able to fund projects, to whereas before we were coming up with facade leases and you're going, what am I really doing? I'm leasing a facade on a building that already exists, but I'm protecting it. And so the 380 provision was added in 2005 to the TIF and made our lives a lot easier because we would have TIF dollars, but we couldn't really support the projects because the projects didn't have any TIF eligible expenses. Now that's kind of out the window with the ability of the 380, so there's nothing that we really can't fund. It just, is that something that the city council and the TIF board desires to fund? And this is the type of project. And that's what I'm going to get into in the next couple of slides. So key elements of an economic development agreement. So and this is just through 25 years of lessons learned and how TIFs kind of work. The first TIF project has a priority of payment over those added later. So we have a first in, first out, and that's very key. Additional payment can be tied to increment generated from the project or increment generated from the whole of the TIF. So you can tie their agreement to what they produce, performance-based on just their project, or let's say that you have a lot of revenue coming from other properties you didn't anticipate, and that's going into the TIF fund. So that's a decision that needs to be made. In the event of a shortfall in TIF revenues, priority payment is applied. So if there's ever a shortfall, changes in valuations that sometimes occur, that person that is first in line and second in line would get all the money, and that's last in line would be out of luck. Their payment would be deferred a year. So it's kind of, there's no other real mechanism for being able to do this, because you can imagine if you had one person that had an agreement, so they're the pie, and they control all the increment, and why would they want to have a pro rata share and bring new people in that would take it? So it's the only fair and equitable way. It's first in, first out. I was the first here. I was the one that took the risk. I reaped the benefits from either my project generated or the district generated increment. And so that's one of the key elements that we find here. I mentioned time frame because I've been bitten a couple of times by this. A development agreement with the TIF board is just one of the components. You can have an agreement all day long and no actual development or increment occur. So it's very important, in my opinion, to have specific completion date for issuance of a building permit and issuance of a certificate of occupancy. An agreement with no effective date can hinder priority in subsequent TIF projects moving forward. So I had a project, we forgot to put this in, this was about 15 years ago, and it didn't say when he had to start and when he had to finish, and we had a 30-year TIF. And so another project came in, but there's that priority issue. So what we try to do is put specific performance benchmarks within those agreements that'll afford for a realistic goal, typically 12 to 24 months to get a building permit, maybe up to 36 months to complete the project. If they don't meet those thresholds, they can just come back and reapply, but they're not holding anybody up that comes behind them. I've even had projects that come in and they're competing, and it really comes down to how they're placed on the agenda, who has priority. So it's who came first. So if it was on the agenda, so the first person to read and get their first development agreement, they have priority of the person that's second on the agenda. So wording and timing on agenda is extremely important, but something that we've learned as you kind of go forward. This is another thing that I like to tell, and y'all know this, and developers need to know this, but they learn it quite quickly as they kind of go through the public-private partnership. Private investment does not equal taxable value. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a developer come in and say, we're going to spend $100 million, and then we look at the comparables, and then what shows up on the tax rolls, it's more like 40. And that's a big difference when you're running numbers. So I just say that the developers will come back and say state law requires appraisal districts to value properties at their fair market value. They do their best, but what your house is on the tax rolls for, you would probably hope you get a little bit more than that. I don't know, in my county they're getting pretty good. Because I don't, and we also have quite a few protests that are going on as well. But this is often difficult given the volume of properties for appraisal districts must manage, and there's a lack of access to the specific sales data. So in most cases, and this is just an opinion, but it's backed up by, I think, some pretty good fact and case study, that the stated taxable value can range, or the state taxable value can range anywhere from 50 to 90% of what a developer says he's going to spend. So, Natalie, when you were at the city of Fort Worth, would y'all use the 75%? So whatever the developer said they were going to spend, they took about 75% of that and said that's what's going to be added to the tax rolls according to the appraisal district. So that's just one of the key things. And the best way to determine taxable value is identified by comparable properties. A lot of times you'll have a developer come in and go, well, you've never seen anything like this before. And I don't want to get into real estate appraisal, but there's three approaches. One is the cost approach, the comparable approach, and the income approach. The comparable approach is what most appraisal districts do. If you protest, then they will do an income approach. I've had a very large high-rise. I've had a mall, and over 1 million square feet, it was valued on an income approach at $3 million because its income was so low. and uses times the cap rate. So all those factors come into the next phases, which are the key stages in facilitating new investment. And I'm going to invite Natalie to come back up and discuss kind of the key stages in the overall development.
Thank you, David. So the first stage is the project analysis. Is this project a good candidate for incentives? And this is something that I would lean heavily on city staff for. They know what the objectives of the city are, and especially now they all have that great plan that what should be dictating and directing you as to what makes a good candidate for incentives. Is this in line with our long-term goals? The incentive package. What amount of incentives does the project need? Again, that will be a balance between city staff analysis and then also the developer ask. Payment method, who and where does the money come from? What are the tools, what are the funds that we have to help make this a reality? The project analysis. When you're considering the developer's proposal for the TIF incentives, a few key items that should be reviewed. Is the project financially feasible? This is something that I think sometimes is overlooked. Does this even make sense with or without incentives? Does the project make sense? Is it sustainable? Is it in line with our market? Is this project financially feasible? They should be able to provide a lender commitment letter. That will be a huge test for city staff and yourselves to be looking at. Has this been financed? Because you can put all the time in the world, but if they can't get financing, it's all for nothing. And their anticipated cash flow from the development. Now, within that cash flow, there should be a gap hindering the project if you're going to be making steps to get involved in a public-private partnership. They should be able to demonstrate a gap that prevents a fair rate of return. And this is when in my opinion, as a former city staffer, some heavy analysis should be taken into their cash flow to make sure to check their assumptions, because if anyone has ever worked with any sort of Excel financial model, if it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't have the right development assumptions in there, and that will be something to kind of do a test to make sure that everything is on the up and up. Is the project consistent with the goals and objective of the TIRZ plan? So one of the steps to creating a TIRZ is to create a project and financing plan, and that's something that the project will have to be tested against. And again, as I said, I would take it even one step further with, does this align with the city's goals? And to discuss the incentive package, I'm actually going to allow David to come up here and speak a little bit on that.
Natalie and I were discussing this a little bit and kind of the approaches, and I'll try to put it in the way I would approach underwriting projects within a TIRZ. There's a few different methods for determining the total amount of the incentive or the source of the incentive. One is to pledge 100% of the increment generated by the project for a number of years. This is common with early on projects, early TIFs. So you have a developer that wants to come in and build a hotel. He's going to have $20 to $40 million. And you say, okay, I'm willing to give you 100% of what you generate from your property for X number of years up to a cap, because everything's based on a projection and we cap it. And so that's common with initial TIF projects and can be used in conjunction with Program 380 agreements. You can pledge a portion of the increment generated for a number of years. So this has application for a wide range of projects and can be used with either TIF or 380 agreements. So instead of taking 100% of that, you say, okay, you're generating $200,000 a year to the TIF. Now, those are tax dollars, and they're going into the TIF fund, but I'm going to give you 80% of that, 90% of that for a number of years up to a cap. That way it allows a little bit more, and sometimes those are more your second and third projects once you've gotten kind of let me also back up and state that a TIF typically takes 3 to 5 years to kind of get stabilized. But if you have projects that are ready to go, and that's just due to the development cycle. You know, if we have a project right now, it's got to get designed, it's got to get a building permit, it's got to get under construction, and then we know as we do our, as we're going through the budget season, January 1 is the snapshot, and then we go through billing, and we don't get that money until January 31st of the following year. So there is a pretty long lag time, about 17 or 13 months before you actually receive that money. And so this allows for TIFs to have increment, to be able to do other projects that might be a streetscape, a Main Street program for streetscape, or some other type of beautification park that might not generate increment. And then there's another one, which is fund all public infrastructure and TIF eligible expenses unrelated to TIF increment. This funding would be tied to amount of money spent by the developer or the TIF eligible expenses. So basically, the developer comes forward and says, well, I'm doing this additional environmental remediation, and that is the cause of my financial gap. Or I'm going to do this additional streetscape that's going to be in the public right-of-way. Or I'm going to do this type of sidewalk or make these improvements. So you just tie those improvements to the increment that's generated from the project. And so what we're trying to say here is that we try to make the agreements performance-based. That the developer or whoever enters into the agreement has to do something and achieve certain benchmarks before they are awarded any money. You don't want to get in the situation where you've given money and then all of a sudden you're going, where'd it go? We don't have anything, and so I think it's just the best practices. And this gets into payment method. Funds for the payment come from two different sources, and this is kind of fundamental to the overall TIF, which is funding for a project will be linked directly to the incentives that the development generates. So just like I was talking about, you have an overall TIF, you have one project here, that project is funding itself. There's another option to where the overall TIF, you just take all the increment because it's such an important project and you pledge it till that project's paid off. So there's multiple options that are available. I have only seen a couple of circumstances to where an overall TIF, the entire TIF revenue was pledged to one project. Once again, that ties up any priority projects, so those that are second in line. So it better be a pretty special project if you're going to pledge the revenues from the entire TIF. All this to say that I kind of recommend on a project by project basis, providing if you generate and you produce, you're going to get your reimbursement that's negotiated per the development agreement. But you're only going to get that once you produce a certificate of occupancy for the building and that you've shown that you've made the required necessary capital improvements. And then TIF funds are very important. So as a former TIF administrator, the best projects are ones that come forward and they don't ask for money. So it comes in and it allows us to pay for nice things and build up a reserve to do special projects. So I know in one of my, in downtown Fort Worth, we built a public market. It was a little bit before its time. And so, but we were able to use that seed money for a public market. We also had excess money, and we'll get into a couple examples, that we could provide leasing. One of the biggest concerns, lease of parking spaces, is we did surveys of downtown, said, why don't you come downtown? And it was security and parking. And so we took care of the security, working with the police department. And then parking, we provided, we leased those spaces after the office workers left. We leased those spaces in the evenings. So there was a reason people to come down and use some of those restaurants. So there's a lot of restaurants in downtown that are very active during the day because they have office workers, but at night it's a ghost town. So it's to create a more 24/7 kind of lifestyle. And the office users were not using that garage anyway. So we would just lease those parking spaces for a real bargain and provide them as free parking. And so I know in downtown Fort Worth, they pride themselves on providing free parking when you come down at night. And it really fosters so that restaurant or retail business just doesn't have a lunch business as a lunch and dinner business. And so that's just a couple of different ways. But those are a couple of things. And also public parks and streetscape. Those are nice. But I can't tell you how many times I've seen a project where we go in, we put in a nice road, nice streetscape, a nice park. Doesn't generate any economic development. Typically, those you want to dangle is kind of on a parallel track with the overall development. A couple of case studies. I think in our presentation at the theater, several people were talking about, well, a lot of what you've talked about has been larger cities or suburbs. I can tell you there's not many downtowns in the state of Texas that don't have a TIRZ attached to them. And so, Natalie, if you would come up and kind of help us explain kind of your reasoning. There's 313, so we were sorting through them. We're happy to provide you with the full list, but Natalie kind of whittled these down to similar size, and also making sure that they were not suburbs of a larger urban area.
Well, that's exactly right. So this is a list of communities, in the parentheses as the population. So we really tried to, get around more or less the population size of Kerrville. And all of these are example communities. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is an example of the types of communities that have a downtown-specific TIRZ. And there's no shortage of examples that we could give you of projects that all of these communities are implementing. And you can see even Dripping Springs, 3,000 is their population. They have a downtown TIRZ, and it's actually quite interesting to see how they work in conjunction with whatever sort of Main Street revitalization efforts that they have.
I applaud Natalie for doing that because I tasked her. I said it can't be a suburb. And so Hutto, I'm doing a TIF, and they're doing a co-op project. They consider themselves, I told her to put that in there, but they are pretty far outside of Austin. But they have some very big plans that are being funded by the TIF, and also with a overlaying PID district. I also did a TIF for the small town of Salina, and they have some great things that are going on, and that's very far north. I almost call it Oklahoma, so you can't really call it a suburb of Dallas. And then I also did a TIF in Azle, which is pretty far outside of Fort Worth, and all of those were with the intent of revitalizing their downtown. With regards to case studies, I think I want to mention a couple of projects. A couple of them I've worked on, a couple of them I have not. I worked on, we were brought in to look at the Amarillo area, and Amarillo was so active along I-20 there with the hotel business, but their downtown had been long neglected. And so we put a TIRZ in place, and we dedicated that revenue stream for facilitating new private investment and improvement of downtown infrastructure. The property values in the TIRZ have increased by 50%. Did you say next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, next slide. Have increased by 50% from 2006 to 2017. So from 139 million in taxable value to 210 million. I was fortunate to work on the Courtyard by Marriott at the historic Fisk building, and they were making a $12 million investment. It was the first hotel in downtown that they had had since, I think, the 20s. 107 rooms. The TIF portion was small, depending on your perspective, of 1.6 million in property tax revenues over 20 years, and then $70,000 to pay for a portion of the cost of trees, lighting, sidewalk amenities that conform to the city's downtown urban design standards. That was really the catalyst. They are now embarking on a convention center hotel using TIF. They're building a downtown ballpark for the Amarillo Dillis, one of the minor league teams. And so there's really been a resurgence in downtown because of developers could see, okay, there's a revenue source that can help me out if I get into a project that needs a little bit of help. And so this was really kind of the catalyst project. And I think I skipped over my favorite, which I administered this for, forgive me, for a number of years, which was Fort Worth. And I think I just gave you a couple of examples. But it was created in 1995, and that story that I was talking about, the stakeholder was the Bass family, and Radio Shack and a couple others said, we haven't seen money invested in downtown since 1972. Where are you spending it? They were spending it up at Alliance and down in South, in the growth areas, in the suburban sprawl. And so the purpose is to assist by attracting public infrastructure improvements, improve transit, support tourism and convention business, and create an environment to attract office, retail, and residential development. Now that I'm not administering the TIF, I got to work with the developer in bringing an AC Marriott to the city. And in downtown, they require triple redundancy for your transformers from Encore, which is the electric provider, delivery provider. So not one transformer, not two, but three. And so I have a client that says, well, that's for the zombie apocalypse, you know, if you ever have to get to the third transformer, because two should be more than enough, but that's what they require. And that was a significant expense to their overall project. So the TIRZ was able to pay for $4.1 million of that project. Majority of that was that transformer, or transformers, plural. Another, which was downtown parking, which I had mentioned before. They had pledged $38 million for parking leases since 1995. In 2018, they have about $1.5 million that goes to parking leases. So just another thing, that was some of the surveys that came back on security and parking. And so they pride themselves on being one of the downtowns that provides free parking. Neighbors to the east have a lot of parking garages that are just boarded up at 5 o'clock and have really struggled to create that 24/7 type of environment. We talked about Amarillo. Another one that we discussed was Georgetown. It was established in 2004. Valuation has more than doubled to $93 million since the TIRZ was created. It was to encourage development and redevelopment of downtown, mixed use, which you hear a lot, pedestrian oriented environment consistent with the goals of the city's master plan. All of these start out with a plan, and so I think your Kerrville 2050 plan kind of lays out a really good template, and so these are kind of the implementation tools. The city's installed 554 new historic sign districts throughout the city, and that was downtown and historic districts. The TIRZ participation was only $5,000, so a lot of this can be just an offset for what a Main Street program is doing or what the city's doing, but the TIRZ can be an important partner in funding that gap. A lot of times, city managers will look, and councils, will look exclusively in an area to the TIRZ to provide that funding, and so a lot of times it's a partnership with all the partners coming together. They've also had improved sidewalks, drainage, and traditional parking on Main that was constructed by a developer. That took as little as $100,000 to kind of facilitate that. So I don't know if you've been to downtown Georgetown, but I think it's a great downtown, one of the real gems in the state of Texas. And so the TIRZ is one of the components. I come from Denton, Texas, and they have a TIRZ in downtown, and it's been very instrumental in helping revitalize some of the shops. They've had devastating fire for what I call the Emmy Moses 5 and Dime. It burned down, and so they're using TIF funds to help revitalize that, address some of the aesthetic concerns, and then also address some of the developer concerns. So I want to talk to you about tasks to move forward to create a TIRZ and answer any questions you may have. One is a taxable value analysis of similar developments and this assumptions of future taxable value. Development projections for future land uses and timing of the proposed development. We did this, we've done an initial taxable value analysis. They are assumptions, but I think working with staff and using our best judgment of knowing where the market was going, looking at vacant parcels or underutilized parcels, we were able to come up with a draft taxable value analysis. I'll get into that here in just a minute. Once that is drafted, then you prepare a preliminary project and financing plan, which is a detailed description of the TIRZ and all the exhibits, and it basically outlines where's the revenue coming from. And it was what Natalie said about Excel, it's sometimes garbage in, garbage out. But if something doesn't occur that's in your projections, it just didn't occur. And so it's, I think staff's job, everybody in the TIF board, the community's job, to make sure everybody knows the mechanisms there to create that increment, because that's key. Because you can put a TIRZ in place and nothing happen, and nobody take advantage of it. And so it's really a public education, and as people approach the city, that they're made aware of it. I don't know if, Mark, were we able to give them a larger handout of this? Or, okay, so I apologize, but maybe those on the, you can see on the screen. These are this is put together by an attorney friend of mine, but it just talks about the legal steps. And so basically you have the public hearing and the creation of the creation ordinance that requires a 7-day public hearing notice. And then you hold that public hearing, you close the public hearing, and then you adopt that creation ordinance. That creation ordinance basically has the boundary, the term, it has the participation, it'll have the TIF board, and let me spend a minute there to talk about TIF boards. The TIF board, the way we typically structure these, we have them, the TIF board reports to the city council. And so I've seen cases to where they have appointed individuals to the TIF board, but ultimately city council can override those decisions. So we typically just make the city council the TIF board, because you're elected by the voters and have the ultimate deciding factor. And so it just makes it a lot more streamlined, because I have seen cases to where TIF boards have been appointed, and there's a lot of disagreement about how money and how TIFs, because they haven't gone through a workshop like this and understand how TIFs work. They go, I just want to give some TIF money to a friend of mine over here, and it goes up to the council, and the council rejects it, and then it goes back to the TIF board, and it's this Congress and Senate jockeying back and forth, and then we have to have committee meetings to come back and forth. It's much better if it's put in place that the TIRZ plan has a good plan. It's been vetted by city council, goes through the TIRZ board. And so I always like to say that you're wearing your city council hat, we recess into a TIF board meeting. I'm sure you have some other boards that are like that. You turn your hat on backwards and you're a TIF board member, and then you flip it on around, and then you approve what you just did. That seems to be the best process. It's not an absolute, but that has streamlined. We've created, how many TIFs have we created in El Paso in the past? Yeah, 4 or 5. And so they used to do the other approach, and now they're decommissioning those old TIFs because of some of that dysfunction between the appointees and the people that ultimately have to make the decisions with public dollars. The schedule that we had before you is we've done the taxable value analysis. I want to mention that we do have a meeting with the appraisal district this afternoon to talk about what they need and some of the information that we need to move forward. But if you would like to proceed, we can bring to you that creation ordinance that establishes those 5 key things by September the 11th, and then have a second reading and have that public hearing. We had talked to Mark about that, because we have to have a public hearing. So basically I would go through the TIRZ, preliminary project and financing plan, and then there'd be a second reading, and then we could have a TIF board appointed at that same time, because it's in the creation ordinance, and if it was city council. And so on October 9th, we would have the TIF board approve the project and financing plan, and then the first reading of that separate document, that creation, or the project and financing plan ordinance, and then the second reading by the 23rd. These last 3 dates, they can slip into next year if they have to. What is critical is that creation ordinance sets the base year. And I think if we go back a slide to that chart that we had, if we do the creation ordinance this year, it sets the base year is January 1 of 2018. So last December, I created 23 TIFs in December over a 3-week period, because everybody realized, oh no, if I wait 2 weeks, my base year is going to be January 1 of 2019, and I'm not going to get increment until 2021. So we understand that, and so we just want to make you aware of that process, that the creation ordinance is the key. I've been on New Year's Eve council agendas so we can get those second readings done. But the way we've laid it out here gets you to a second reading, but what's in those final project and financing plans can be amended by simply making an amendment in the public hearing, and so just like any other agreement that you have out there. But I think what you'll find is that we put together a TIF plan that basically provides you with a very flexible menu about how to go forward. So it's not too structured, so we don't have to have too many procedural elements of how we move forward and fund a project if this is the project we really want to do. Natalie, I want you to walk through kind of we looked at 2 different districts, and if you can kind of explain some of the characteristics. And I also must say that one of the restrictions, a couple of the restrictions, you can't have more than 30% of your overall TIRZ be residential. And what does that mean? It means anything less than 5 residential dwelling units, okay? And it's use, not by zoning, but it's use. So at the time of creation, so I've created greenfield TIFs, and at the time of the use, they were vacant ag. And then we built a subdivision with 1,500 homes in it. And the TIF money was used to pay for the water, roads, and streets and the like. So the 30% is a very important component. We're going to be working with CAD. We believe this on the larger one that we're a little less than 15%, so we're well below that 30%. The idea is that you don't go and capture large neighborhoods, and they want to limit, taking those neighborhoods or single-family residential and limiting that exposure. And so that's something that the legislature has put into place as a cap. So Natalie, if you don't mind kind of walking through.
Not at all. So this is what we called scenario 1. I believe you've seen these boundaries in a previous presentation. You can see it goes, the western boundary is there on the Guadalupe River, and it goes all the way to Pascal Avenue. These are the larger boundaries. In general, it's our belief that capturing as much of that riverfront property as possible has a great potential for your community, for development opportunities. Capturing as much of that as possible gives yourselves greater opportunities for new development and redevelopment, and ultimately increment that can be used to fund projects. This is scenario 2. Just clicking back and forth, you can see the main difference is on that southern edge right there. It, instead of going all the way down, down there to Travis, it ends at Water. So based on our analysis and the opportunities that we saw of vacant parcels and parcels that were really ripe for redevelopment, we recommended moving forward with the scenario 1. And that's what these development assumptions that David will speak more about are based on that larger scenario 1.
One of the hardest things that I have in my job is doing this crystal ball development. So I task Natalie and I say, okay, first of all, give me all the vacant parcels within there. And so she did a great job working with the GIS to identify those vacant parcels, and then say, what's logical in those infill sites. And so what you'll find is this is a crystal ball. These are assumptions, but I've had a pretty good track record of putting these in place, and where we started and where we ended up, there's a lot of ebb and flow, but we typically end up where we thought we would end up. Let me also say that there is no penalty for swinging for the fences on what the development will be. If less development occurs, it just means less increment that's going to occur, but we want to be realistic. So I can be a Debbie Downer a lot of times and say, well, no, that'll never work, and I don't think that will work. But going through this process and talking with staff, we talked about, I think that would be great for a hotel, or I think there's a lot of smaller hotel type uses that could be in your downtown area, kind of something in the smaller range, not 200-room hotels, but something that would offer a more intimate, family type of experience. And so These project uses of retail, office, residential, and hotel. And so we have created this model, and we look at real property, personal property, sales tax, and hotel occupancy tax. So we kind of do a tax increment model, tax increment value, and value analysis, and basically show where the developments are coming from. And you really have to break these things down into 5-year chunks. If I'm telling you here today that I know what's going to happen 25 years from now, you know, you should be laughing at me. And it's really hard to go beyond that 5-year horizon. But I know that I feel that there's a strong desire to live downtown and in some new higher mixed use type environments with retail on the bottom floor, loft space up above, and also with the multifamily. I see some office, but I really see in the retail, multifamily, and the hotel being your biggest opportunities in the downtown area. And so this is just kind of showing the overall breakup of those projections. Once again, these are just projections, assumptions, and we know about assumptions. So, but I want you to know that there was a lot of reasoning and thought and heartburn on my end about what went into the model, about how we project what's going to happen over the next 30 years. And so, we might have some questions about that, and we're happy to answer those. With regards to the city participation, with the TIF, the city would fund public infrastructure. The city would contribute a percentage, and we don't have that, and I think that's yet to be determined, of its real property within the boundaries and this is this menu that I'm talking about that gives you the ultimate flexibility. Water, sanitary sewer, storm, transit, parking, street, intersection, open space, park, recreation facilities and improvements, and then the one I love, economic development grants, because that opens, that gives you a lot of flexibility on how you're able to use those funds. If somebody came to you and said, hey, I have a really neat idea for this vacant parcel, I need to go vertical, 3 stories, it fits within code, but my costs are just getting a little out of whack, so my rate of return, nobody will lend me the money unless I get a little bit back. And that's where the TIF can step in and make a difference. And so we've run the analysis on 3 different scenarios, and it's if you ran it and put 100% of everything that was generated, so we created that TIRZ, and you just said, okay, I'm comfortable with everything that we're making off of that downtown, and then any new increment, 100% goes into the TIRZ to help fund it, that would be approximately $19 million. If you did 75%, so there's a 75-25, so for every dollar generated, you get to keep a quarter, that would be $14 million. And then just a straight down 50-50 split would be about $9.6 million. Now we could have a huge project come in that could blow these numbers out of the water, but I think with the footprints that we have, we're not talking about urban renewal here. We're talking about reinvestment in the area, and that is something that it should be considered as we kind of go forward. So the overall revenue, I mentioned that we look at real, personal, sales, and hotel occupancy tax. So if you look at what's generated, you have a total of $53 million from the city of Kerrville, 19, this is under the 100% scenario, going to the city. So you're getting the benefit of those sales tax dollars and that hotel occupancy and new business personal property that's being invested in the area, while giving up that ad valorem during that period. The other taxing jurisdictions reap the benefits as well, and they are also able to participate if they so choose. And sometimes those can be delicate and long discussions about the benefit. But for this scenario, we just ran the city's participation. I do want to also add that the state law does allow you to put in sales tax. At this time, I would recommend not doing that because you have the ability to do 380. Let's say you had somebody that came into downtown, I don't know, a brewery or something like that, and they needed some help. You could do a separate 380 within the TIF just between the council and that entity to give them a sales tax or anything along those lines. But we have found that if you're collecting sales tax for an aggregate whole, it's very cumbersome. We have to work with the comptroller because there's so many accounts and so many people doing work out of their house and how we collect it. It's much better to kind of do one-offs, but you do have the ability to put into a sales tax into the TIRZ. And then with that, I'd leave it to questions. Hopefully you've seen that we've done quite a few of these, and we want to be here to be a resource and be a help to you. Natalie, just most recently working for the city of Fort Worth, coming to work for me in January, administered. How many TIFs do you have in Fort Worth? 15 TIFs. So some of them large, some of them small. So from there, I'll just happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the experience that you bring to this. That's invaluable. Here's how I would like for us to do the questions, and that is do some round robin, starting over with place 1, and then 2, 4, 5, and come back to me, and then back to 1. Each of us with a question, so everybody's got time to ask whatever needs to be asked.
Absolutely.
Mr. Vogel.
You answered most of my questions as I was writing them, but on the actual map, I guess at the very north part of the map, that seems to be all city property. Is there a reason that that's included?
Kind of what's the benefit to public
Yeah,
use
what's,
to
yeah.
having that?
It's slide 37.
City.
I'll let you go. I think we worked with staff on kind of coming up with some of the initial boundaries of where we thought the best opportunities for development. And so did I understand your question? You're saying there was a lot of city property
Yeah, I
in
think
there?
that whole block is city property.
Right, and so no harm, no foul by including them in there because they're not going to contribute increment, but they are assets nonetheless to where people come and visit. And so building around them has always been key. The one thing you want to shy away from is we're working with the city of El Paso. They created one that was nothing but city property or tax exempt property, so it's had no increment for 5 years. So we're being brought in to kind of increase the size. So the size of the TIF can actually generate some increment.
Okay.
So it's a careful balance, but that 30% it's residential excludes publicly owned property. So that doesn't become part of the calculation, but I think any downtown it's important because there might be some park improvements or some others that you want to have included within the zone. Now I also want to make clear that the statute, as we've worked through it for many years, you typically want to have all your investments within the zone. You can make investments outside the zone, but you have to make a finding that those investments benefit the zone. So we always say that's a pretty high bar to kind of cross, but we've always included the civic center of the city, including city and county buildings. Can you add anything to that?
Councilman, are you talking about the service center area?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I think what we did in driving this area, we were just trying to stick with some clean lines on roads, so there's really not, as far as staff's concerned, any preference one way or the other to include it or not. It was
Okay.
just kind of a clean line.
One thing that I would just take into consideration is when we're looking at the district, especially downtown districts, I always think that it's nice to create a sense of place. And so if there's something that you want to do, some sort of beautification project throughout a district, would it make sense to have those types of signs in that particular region or area? And so if it makes sense within to include the public-owned buildings within your district, I would lean towards including them versus carving it out, and that way that one pocket would be left without the continuation of trees or whatever, even though, as David said, you could make the argument that because it's within a certain, proximity to the district.
Another reason that, not that we did it for this reason, and Mark gave you the reason that we have included the public properties here, but because you set up a TIRZ, typically when you're selling publicly owned land, you have to go through a public bid process. This is one of 8 exceptions in Chapter 272 of the Local Government Code that allows for a direct sale between a city and a developer. So if you have a developer and you have a piece of property that's city-owned and you want them to do the project and you put in all the performance measures, this allows for the direct sale without going up to an open public bid and taking, whoever bids and you don't know their ability to perform. So a lot of times we'll create a TIF district for the sole purpose of being able to transfer land without public bid. So that's just another little side
Yeah,
note.
that's pretty interesting.
But it also, I mean, the TIRZ allows for spending on public works and things like that. So if it's publicly owned land, that actually falls under that as well. So isn't it a way to possibly, I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but to funnel the money to, say, City Hall if they were going to revamp City Hall?
That's I can tell you, you're familiar with South Lake. They
Yeah.
created a TIRZ, and the county is a participant in that TIRZ at a pretty high rate. And when they saw City Hall right there, they said, we're not going to be paying for
Right.
your City Hall. So they exempted that in their participation agreement. But you're exactly right. Part of the TIF went to pay for parking and their City Hall.
Okay.
Okay. Question?
Yeah, I'm going to have to do a couple of them because they kind of stick together. But the first one is really just a housekeeping. Are we going to create this based on a petition? Is that how we're doing this, or is the city actually creating this?
The
What-
city would be creating it by ordinance.
But I mean, under what of that chapter 311, which item are we actually saying?
Okay, so there's two ways that you can create a TIF. One is through designation, having a public hearing and designation by the city council. The second is by petition driven,
Right.
and that has 51% of the property owners petitioning, kind of like a public improvement
Right.
district. The only difference with a petition driven TIF is the makeup of the board.
Right.
Is that you have to have the state rep and the U.S. Senate rep as well. So they have to be a part of your board.
They actually, don't they normally just kind of pass it off to somebody though?
I had
You haven't
Senator
had one?
Wendy Davis on mine. I've had a
Okay.
lot of the different senators that have been a part of it. And then typically we've done that when we've had some large areas that were residential and they didn't meet the test. There's also, there's a criteria, and it says, without the but-for test is
Right.
a lot what we talk about. I encourage, and I'll send to every council member, Texas Municipal League puts out an economic development handbook on best practices. And so we typically quote a section in there that it's, faulty layout,
Right.
sidewalks, and then predominantly vacant or underutilized. And unless you make a capricious, there's a little Attorney General's opinion, they're going to defer to City Council on whether that zone was worthwhile of being created and meeting the criteria. So no zone has ever been challenged if a council has quoted those reasons, as long as they haven't been arbitrary and capricious. And so I think seeing the lack of investment in the area, there's a number of different things that you can use. But I've seen also with the city of Arlington, we had an area that was the corner of I-20 and Matlock, and we were building a big retail center. And the city attorney said, I don't know if this really meets the statutory requirements. So we had to do a petition driven to get around those provisions of creating. But it's really a subjective finding of the city council of, is this needing of a reinvestment and basically a shot in the arm in meeting one of those criteria. So there's two ways. One, city council does it. That's the standard way of doing it. We have a handful of petition driven TIFs.
Okay.
Ms. Agner?
Yes, dumb question.
Yes, ma'am.
Why do we not go across the river at all?
We are happy to look at that. I think we were looking at development opportunities. We are maxed. Your city that's less than 100,000, you can put up to 50% of your taxable value into a TIRZ. But I also want to be protective of trying to balance the budget. That if any new development's going to occur, that otherwise you would hate to include areas that would have development that would occur otherwise without the TIF. And so
Yeah, we took a hard look at that, and the decision was made to recommend this, and then if we needed to amend the boundary for some specific project that made sense, we could do that and bring it in. So if the mall
Okay.
area were to redevelop, for example,
Yes, that's what I was
that you
thinking
could
of.
pull all that in. But the other thing is, that, just as he said, is capturing too much increment, which means that it's not going to the general fund to fund government. And we've seen what's happened with property values this last year. And so it's a little bit of a balancing act. So that's the reason why.
I have another just real world example. We were doing a TIF in Irving, and they said, well, why don't we, it's along Irving Boulevard, why don't we just go across the freeway and pick up Irving Mall? And that's in a precarious position because it's several different ownerships. And so it's currently on the tax rolls, let's say at 80 million. But if all those tenants leave, it could go to 3. That could have a detrimental effect to your overall TIF increment because you set your base, and let's say you set your base at 300 million and all of a sudden you had 80 go away. You're going to have $80 million worth of increment before you get back to your normal position. So so a lot of times we'll go in and we'll remove properties so we can improve the financial strength of the overall TIF. But the overall city's taking a hit. So the story I always like to say is downtown Fort Worth, we had a tornado come, and so I had a building that was worth $37 million, and within a matter of seconds it went down to $3 million. So I lost $34 million in increment in less than a minute. So you can lose value as quickly as you can gain it. Those are acts of God, and they don't often happen. But I also had the Radio Shack campus, which was appraised at $56 million, come down to 26 because they vacated it, and there was no tenant. So on those income-producing properties, we've had a lot of issues, and so the result, how we saved that TIF, was we removed those from the TIF, and it removed that base, and so we reset that base. So careful considerations as we kind of go into, but you can always add it.
Modifying the boundary, though, what's involved in doing that? Is it a city council thing, or is it a TIRZ board, or what?
It's a city council thing, and so we'll be
It's
doing
an
that.
ordinance amendment then, right?
So basically, it's an amendment to the creation ordinance, and we bring it to you. You publish it 7 days in advance. You have a little area shown in the paper that you plan on including. You hold a public hearing and say, this is what we plan on doing with it. And then what happens, as soon as you approve it and you do that second reading, it's the amended creation ordinance. As soon as that's done, you'll have basically a TIF 1 that has a base, 2018, and let's say you added that in 2020, and then we have 1A. So the appraisal district will have a separate base for that additional area that's added. So I've been known to have 5 or 6 different sub-accounts due to the additions, because once again, we don't have the perfect crystal ball.
And the boundary doesn't have to be contiguous, does it?
No, that has been changed.
Okay.
All right, Ms. Sigerman.
Okay, this may be a dumb question too.
There
but
are no dumb questions,
I know,
okay?
and I'm not gonna, not ask. Proportionate share, is that how it works as far as the increment itself? Let's say there's a new hotel that comes next year and it's the biggest chunk of change as far as the tax money. When they go to apply for their benefit from the increment, do they get the 40% or the 10%, or is it just whatever
So
the
typically
need
the way
is?
we would structure, let's say we had a project that came in that was a $2 to $3 million project. We would typically look at the underwriting and say, okay, we don't have any money in the TIF now, but based on your projections, we're going to have $3 million that's going to be added. That $3 million is going to generate, $30,000. We'll give you that $30,000 up for 5 years, up to $150,000. Okay, the big project comes in. Once you've met that first year's obligation of paying that $30,000, anything above that can go to the second project. Okay. So it's not proportional share. I mean, actually, it's kind of as soon as you've met those obligations, and so that's where that priority of payment comes in. Then you're able to fund that second one. So they're in second position.
Okay.
So they just want to make sure that there's enough revenue. Anytime I get hired by a private developer, they go, okay, where's my position? And how healthy is the TIF?
Right.
And what's remaining on the obligations outstanding within the TIF? How soon are they going to be paid off?
Could you have 5 people in line for first place, so to speak? I mean, I mean, does that ever happen where you have competition for
I've only
being
had
the first one in line?
circumstances where I've had 2 projects come in at the same time, and they're at different levels. Because anybody can scratch something down on a site plan and say, I plan on doing this, but until we can really get and peel back the onion and get to underwriter and basically say that this is a real project, we have lender, we have equity, this is a real project, they have done architectural, they've met with the city staff, So typically we know, and then we just take them on a first come, first served basis. And sometimes the ask will be too large that we just can't tolerate that. And so they might go to the bottom of the line because they need to get realistic with their expectations. The TIF is not expected to be a windfall. It's to fund to a fair rate of return.
I have one more question.
We'll come back.
Okay, sorry, there's only one question.
Where typically can you park the money while you've got the funds and you want to draw down some interest? Where can you do that?
The statute and in the creation ordinance requires you to create a TIRZ fund that's within the city. And so basically within the city there will be a fund. It's just called the TIRZ fund, City of Kerrville Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone number 1 fund. And so each year, once you've received that money from the tax assessor collector, you will put that money into that fund. Now it can be, as long as you have the money there, I won't get into your accounting systems, but there's a fund that essentially the city controls. And so even if you had county and others, let's say you had the county participate, you will invoice them for their share. They will pay you and you put it into that TIRZ fund. Okay. So all payments are made from the TIRZ fund. And that is one of the requirements of the creation ordinance, is that a TIRZ fund be created.
And the interest on it would be managed just like the rest of our funds pursuant to state law and requirements for interest earned.
Okay. All right. Mr. Vogel.
I don't have any more questions.
All right. Mr. Brady.
So just in general terms, it sounds like everything we're doing in the TIRZ is available to the city on its own without a TIRZ. So other than steering us towards spending in a certain area, are we really doing anything? Because like we can do a 380 agreement all day long, right? And so are we actually creating a new way of doing something, or is it simply just general fund money being used for economic development, which we can kind of do
that's
now?
a very, very good question. The answer is that the TIRZ gives you some ability to fund programs that otherwise you wouldn't be able to through traditional city mechanisms like 380. For example, if you were to sell city property, that would be, you have the ability to have direct sale. You also have the ability to have others participate in the economic development of your overall, and I know that's a tough sell with a lot of the other taxing jurisdictions, but I'd say about half of our TIFs have other city or other taxing jurisdiction participation like the county. And so, but the most important thing I think for me is that it shows the development community and it shows the community at large that you have a commitment to this area. And so it's not just a one-off, we're not just going to do this one project and leave, that it's an ongoing commitment and that there's an ongoing revenue source. So we constantly have developers come up and they say, okay, I own this piece of property, or I purchased this, or I have it under contract. What can the city do? And if we just say, well, they could do a 380, that's a pretty high bar that we have to jump through. And if they have a TIRZ plan and it's well thought out, that makes it a lot easier for those discussions. Same analysis occurs. Natalie, you might want to add about the analysis that we do about whether a project's in or outside of a TIRZ. But a lot of times you'll have those excess revenues that come from the additional property increases. So as one property is improved, you have increased revenue from other properties as well because the rising waters, and so you have that money available as well to seed specific development. So it avoids, if I can put this tactfully, going through the city budget process every year trying to fight for what you need. And the other thing I'd say about 380s is legally those are only annual contracts according to the state of Texas. So if you ever wanted to balance your budget, you could terminate 380s, and that's not spelled out that way, but that's the way the law is. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean you can terminate those because those are subject to annual allocations. Yeah. The TIRZ is an actual pledge of funds over a period of time. And so a 380 from a TIRZ is much different than a 380 straight from the city, because it's subject to those annual
So the other side of the
allocations.
question is actually valid. It's a way to use general fund money. It's a way to make it easier to use general fund money for economic development, correct? I mean, we currently have an EIC, that's a different thing, but this is a way to get at some general fund money to target to economic development, right?
Correct, and it basically goes back to reinvesting those dollars into a targeted area and for these specific projects. I like to say that there's two mother may-Is. You have to go to the TIF board and to the city council to approve that. But if you just did a straight up 380 agreement with one person within that area, it would be subject to annual allocations. Me as a developer, I have, nobody's really ever defaulted on a 380 agreement, but I could see some banker going, well, wait a minute, this is an annual contract.
Right.
Because you know how councils can't be buying future city councils.
Right.
The TIRZ is actually a way to be able to commit those dollars.
And if I may, I think that one of the strengths that I see from the TIRZ is that it actually really promotes transparency on both ends, and it allows for a measuring tool to use to measure the project against. And so for me, if you are city staff and someone comes in and they say, we want to do a project in this area, if you have the TIRZ, if it's within the TIRZ, it makes it easier to say, is this project in line with what we're looking for in terms of investment? And as a developer, if you're just going to say, well, I want to build something, how does Kerrville look? And you're looking and there's no districts in place, where do you even begin to look to target for your development? But if you see that there's a TIRZ, instantly in the developer's mind, they say, okay, this city has taken proactive steps to go move forward. They're serious about wanting investment. They're going to be open to our discussion. Let me pull up the TIRZ plan and let me see if my project is in line with what they're looking for. And that just makes the process so much easier. If they can see the TIRZ project and financing plan and say, my project makes no sense, then I won't guarantee that they won't approach the city for money, but they might take a pause before doing that. So as a city staffer and also being on the developer side, just makes everything much more transparent, and it just really streamlines the process.
Ms. Wagner?
Yes, mine has to do with kind of a perception question, and there's two of them, if I may. One is, do you have problems with the public looking at the council as being both the TIRZ board and the council, that it should be broader in scope than that?
The TIRZ board is really restricted by the TIRZ plan, because the TIRZ plan allows them to spend money on these specific items, and I think we listed out those specific items. They're broad, but ultimately all that TIRZ board is a recommending body to the city council. So typically the city council is much more adept at following development programs and knowing the difference between a tax abatement and a 380 and a TIF and the ways that we can fund projects. And so there's some policy decisions that need to be made in there. And so we've never had any, I've actually seen the opposite. I've seen where people go, these TIF boards are just turning into chaos because you have different factions fighting, and then they're recommending to the city council. And the city council goes, no, that's not what we intended when we set this thing up. And it doesn't really matter what, it's kind of like planning and zoning. I hate planning and zoning because it's not a linear process for me. It's too much emotion. But you know, the P&Z, she was on P&Z in Fort Worth, by the way, and so she knows what it's like. But you know, they can make a recommendation, and you feel as a whole, as a body, that that's not the best interest. You're the ultimate deciders.
Anyway, so, and then the other with perception. Have you run into where the public looks at, and we look at our map here, and they say, oh my gosh, you've expanded your historic downtown, and you've got all these things in place, and it means that we're going to lose our residences, where the city's going to end up coming in and taking over in some of these areas. Is that?
No, and so you know, one of the things is that we exclude the use of eminent domain as a use within the TIRZ. And as you might know, that eminent domain cannot be used for economic development purposes. And so that's been very, very clearly articulated in state law in the past 3 legislative sessions. So you're not going to find yourself in somewhat cases that they had earlier on, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, to where they were doing taking homes for large commercial projects. I was a part of 2 projects, the Trinity River Vision in Fort Worth, and also the building of Jerry World, I keep on Dallas Cowboys Stadium, and they were exempted under that rule because they were building a sports venue, and they were allowed to do that for economic development. But for all practical purposes, eminent domain is off the table.
But wait, to that, is there not, I mean, we're allowed to exclude it, but in the Chapter 311, there is actually provision for making the, if we have a zone with property standards in the business district here, and the business doesn't want to keep themselves up, there is provision in the Chapter 311 to actually sort of go through the process of taking that from them.
No.
Well, it's the, I mean, I'll go back and look what the number was, but it's in there that it basically says that. It does, it's, eminent domain is eliminated, yeah. But this other version of kind of imposing that code on a property is in there.
So the TIRZ doesn't touch anything with regards to zoning, or
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not about. It's not about zoning. It's not about enforcing. But it does. It is about using the TIF money to essentially.
I think I know where you're going. Is the TIF has the ability to use money to assemble property, if they so choose, for economic development purposes, but that's just through a straight negotiation, and there's no threat of eminent domain.
Yeah, I'll look it up and talk to you.
Okay,
about that
and also let you know that in that TML handbook, they have a whole section on the use of eminent domain, and basically you just can't do it.
Okay. Ms. Siegerman, back to your question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
That's all right.
have 3 questions. Other taxpayers' perception of this plan, I mean, I'm all in favor of our downtown and doing whatever we can to keep it thriving. And that's what I would say, but I've had some conversations already with some people probably not in the know as much as far as what we've been trying to do with our 2050 plan and all. And so they feel threatened possibly that the loss of this increment that would go to the broad picture is now going to the zone. So what would you say to someone who had that question or concern?
I think I'd first say that without a strong downtown, you don't have a strong city.
I would
So,
say that too.
and it's a catalyst for additional things occurring. We see that in all cities that have made major investments in their downtown. Downtowns have seen a decline for many years. It's extremely difficult with the rise of strip centers and others for main mom and pop stores to survive, and so TIFs have become mechanisms that help support that mom and pop type of business. As we pulled up here, I saw you had a couple of for lease signs in a couple of your downtown properties, and the TIRZ is, if you have a successful downtown, you're going to have a successful city. And so it's a number of different ownerships. In Fort Worth, we were just mentioning in other cities that we have, they have upwards of 15 to 20. So if there's other areas that feel that they're being neglected or need strategic investment, those would be worthy of looking at TIF. But I think any city, and you asked Texas Municipal League, Texas Downtown Association, downtown is the first place to start, because without a strong downtown, you don't have a strong city.
The other thing that I would add is that the council has the option to not do 100% capture. So you could do, say, 75% or something
Right.
like that. So you still have 25% going to the general fund.
And one thing that I would note is that the purpose of the TIF is not just to capture that 3% increment that comes from rising property values. The purpose of the TIF is really to, as David said, act as a catalyst, and so it's much more than above and beyond than what would happen without the use of the TIF. In theory, that's what we're aiming for, and so there's going to be a lot more tax dollars and a lot more increment for everyone, especially if you decide to participate at 75% or 50%. Then that increment, that portion is much greater than without the use of the TIF. If you were to do nothing per se, that scenario, there would be
and we're happy to work that up, but once again, it's an assumption with the crystal ball. What's going to happen to your downtown if you don't do this?
Right.
And so a lot of times when we present these to city council, we say, here's a do something and here's a do nothing. And so as Mark just articulated, if you did 75%, so 100% of nothing is nothing.
Right.
But, 25% of something is something. So it's, those are some of the arguments that we make when we go through this process.
Okay, all right. Mr. Fogle? No? Okay, Mr. Rudy?
So the one I just found it, so you can look it up later, but 311.008 is
Okay.
given powers of municipality or county, and it's got in there saying, consistent with the project plan for the zone, it can acquire blighted, deteriorating, undeveloped, or inappropriately developed real property or other property in a blighted area or federally assisted, blah, blah, blah. So we have the ability to exclude portions of this, and I would recommend that we do that, because this is in there kind of giving the authority to a TIRZ to do this type of thing, and if nobody is intending to do that, we should probably exclude it.
I think the key there is there is no use of eminent domain. So if and it typically takes somebody issued the initiative of a city staff person or somebody else to go and say, hey, I want to purchase this, but that's on a free market basis. There is no mention of use of eminent domain within those contexts. So if there was a number of dilapidated and somebody came and paid a fair market price, but let me also say this before I go down that trail, is that I don't see TIFs buying a lot of property. I would say 90% of the TIFs that I've created are not in the business of buying property. They are in the business of doing that community development, business retention, and filling that gap. There have been some circumstances to where we said, okay, we have some additional money. We'd like to make this area a park, but that's typically hand in hand with the city and what the city's desire is. And so, but I would say the key in that provision is there's no eminent domain language.
Right, but that wasn't my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, because there's another place in there that talks about it, for those of us up here are going to understand the UDC type of thing that can be applied to a zone, and we also want to avoid doing that. But those are things that need to be dealt with. But the real question to my turn was basically, was kind of, I forget which, was it Ms. Eigner or Ms. Seagram was kind of talking about it, but this is one of those things, kind of like sales tax rebates, where it's a but-for situation. You've got an increment and you've got all that, and that's all good. But if in a town like this we keep hearing over and over about our residential burden of property tax versus our commercial, it's out of whack. Okay, so the danger in this is if we incentivize a business that's already in our area, if you will, to relocate into the zone, we're kind of skewing it a little bit more, are we not? I mean, that's a danger, is it not?
I would say that would be some of the project analysis that the city staff would go through, because as you do a net benefit or cost benefit analysis, if you're currently getting revenue from a business that's within the city and then you're putting it into the TIRZ, it's a loss to the city's general fund because that money is going to be going to the TIRZ now.
Right.
So I would say that staff would probably have, unless there's compelling other arguments, that they would probably recommend against incentivizing, a project moving from one location to the next.
Right. But staff wouldn't be recommending that. The business might see a benefit even if we don't give them direct input into their relocation. I might take my business and move it into the TIRZ because the amenities that are built up in that TIRZ zone are going to be beneficial to me, and I'm seeing that as a buzz place, and I want to move them in. Staff has no control over a business saying I want to relocate into there. So when they relocate, just like you said, we're basically taking a general fund hit and throwing that percentage off again. Nothing we can really stop them from moving in.
Natalie might have a comment on this, but the backfill of that space, is important, just as people upgrade their facilities
Yeah.
and move to new locations and new opportunities. If I'm a retail operator, I want to go where there's the most traffic. And if we're extremely successful, you know, there's going to be, we hope that there's more traffic, and, you know, they would be paying higher rents, you know, so everybody's doing better. And so I defer to Natalie if you have any additional comments to that.
One of the things that I would say to that is that the TIRZ deals with real property tax.
Right.
And so unless they build a building, there will not be increment. I mean, the property as it leases up, if there's a vacant building and as it leases up, it will increase somewhat in taxable value. But the real increment is going to come from new construction, new properties being added to, or a conversion of an underutilized property to and so the building that is being vacated
Right.
might see a little bit of decrease in property value, but unless they raise the building to make it a field, that property value doesn't just go away.
No, but I mean, like I say, the risk is that we're shifting things. It's not just property tax we're talking about, it's a vacant building. That's an issue on a different level. But if we're incentivizing that move, we have to deal with that, is what I'm saying. And so I'm not suggesting that you're supposed to tell us how. I'm just saying this is something we should be considering.
Over concentration.
Yeah, I mean.
And I want to, Natalie pointed out something, that the new construction, but you bring up a valid point. But I think is it consistent with what you've heard from the community of where you want to make your investments and where you want to have resources directed? And so just by vacating that space, and if we're looking at it's just a transfer of sales tax, and if they're generating more sales downtown than they were here, I've actually done deals before to where we've had projects come into a TIRZ, and it was actually a Joann's, and they were going from 32,000 to I think 130,000.
Right.
And so we said, okay, we're going to keep the revenue that you get from the existing and only give you on the increment that's occurring there. And so then the market just took care of the backfill of that space. And so, but I think that's a careful consideration that needs to be made.
Let's move on.
Well, I think maybe mine bounces off of Mr. Baruti's. And existing businesses that are in these areas will not automatically become a part of it into a TIRZ. This is only new construction.
Well, no, they will benefit from the investment in the area.
In the area.
And the overall general increase in commercial activity. But unless they actually make an application, so let's say we have an existing business within downtown or within the zone that says, you know, I plan on making a $3 million capital improvement to my restaurant, and I would like the city to help me out with, or the TIF to help me out with $100,000 for this, you know, new streetscape or whatever they're going to have as outdoor pavilion. That would be their opportunity to look for. But there are benefits for just being within the TIRZ,
yes.
because they're going to receive the additional funding, to whereas traditionally they've been neglected in the past because there hasn't been a high concentration of businesses there before.
But, I mean, they'll be within the TIRZ, period.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and can they petition? They can petition to not be, and how does that process work?
It is the property owners do not have the decision whether to be in or out of that's city council's decision.
Hey, Ms. Siegman?
My question is really kind of more for the city as well. When is the last time we invested in downtown? Just a guess. Does anyone know?
Well, I mean, it depends on what we're looking at.
Yeah.
So, for example, this building.
Well, that's,
and the
yeah.
plaza.
Right.
And streets, the parking garage improvements that y'all just approved. The streetscape that we're looking at now for Water Street. So there is, and you know, signals that TxDOT's put in. There's definitely been some investment.
And so parking is still an issue downtown, even though we have a great space for them to go to.
I think it's a perception that it's a problem.
It is,
and
but.
there's some things that we need to work on.
Right. So hopefully we'll get to do that. Anyway, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You mentioned this at the outset, David, but how many cities in Texas have TIRZ?
There's over 313 TIRZ Do you know how many cities?
I wouldn't know how many cities, because there are large cities have several,
Uh-huh.
but I would probably put it at about 200.
Okay. We can get you an exact number right after this meeting.
Okay.
Because, and let me say that the state comptroller has a registry of all TIFs, and that's one of the annual reporting requirements is to report to the state comptroller. I have a lot of clients that don't fill out that report, so that 313 is on the low side as far as TIFs. Is it, Natalie hears me, there's no such thing as the TIF police because it's the comptroller's office. And so a lot of these are left up to the individual taxing jurisdictions. And so, and then also the, you know, unless there's an AG opinion that's out there, we take direction from the Texas Municipal League and best practices put out by the comptroller's office.
All right, Mr. Brody.
Yeah, is there, there's kind of a string of them that kind of follow, they're pretty quick questions.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is there a reason, is there a negative reason to have the boundary be expanded? Other than what you described before, where property that you expanded into is looking to drop in value. If it was just a straight up, you know, decent property, whatever, is there a reason not to expand it?
And I always favor, you know, casting a wider net, but we have to also look at, you know, what's right for development and redevelopment. And so as long as you're not hitting that 30%, you know, residential, and you're not hitting that 50% of your taxable value going into the TIF, you know, larger areas tend to lend themselves to creating, you know, better opportunities for increment. You're not just being site specific. So if we just put a TIF around one block, and also this gets into some other things about TIFs, but you know, typically they like to see underwriters and others when they look at TIF financials, you know, TIFs of at least, you know, 50 acres, you know, those type of things. And so the negative consequences outside of the impact to those properties that are being, you know, included, and whether they're residential, I wouldn't see casting a larger net being an adverse effect.
Okay, and the 30% thing is not a value thing, it's a
It's a use.
it's a size use, right?
It's a value. It's determined on value.
It is?
Yes.
Okay.
So, so essentially, you can't have more than 30% of your overall base value be residential use at the time of creation.
Okay, and in that scenario, you're saying your preliminary guess is that this is scenario 1 that we've got written here. You're suggesting that it's 15%?
Yeah, it's probably less than that. We're meeting with the appraisal district to get the
Okay.
use codes
Okay.
today.
And those don't include, if there's apartments in there, those don't count,
If
right?
it's 5 units or more,
Right.
it does not.
Because where everybody probably assumes I'm going, I'm just going to go there, which is, you were at the meeting that we talked about it, right? So is there any negative aspect to, other than the limitation of the 30%, to putting circles around residential areas with the express purpose, really, of freezing their taxes? Because if the thought was the increment goes up, you essentially have an agreement of a tax abatement or whatever has to be done, where the increment to that particular property, which is an appraisal district deal, gets rebated back to that property owner. It's a protection, if you will, against the stuff that we talked about that meeting. Is there a reason, is there a downside to doing that? It doesn't affect the TIRZ increments, because if we don't include them, there's no increment from them anyways, right?
Well, I think we have to realize that the city's tax rate is such a small portion, and so the other taxing jurisdictions, so if you have an increase in taxable value,
Right.
And so the city's at 55 cents,
Right.
and if you're at overall 3%, my inclination, because I've never seen that done before, to where they put in programs to where we're going to give you money back, is just to exclude those residential areas that you want to protect.
But that's not the protection I'm trying to. It's basically, it's an area. It's a zone, if you
Correct.
will, that is going to be asked. It's a tool. I'm utilizing TIF dollars here, basically, in the situation where you're not actually, if you exclude them, you're not protecting against what we're trying to protect against. If you include them, the real question is there any true harm to the TIRZ and its functionality if all we're doing is the increment that comes from the residential that we circled is going to stay within the residential, if you will, under that specific way? That doesn't harm the TIRZ functionality as a whole, does it?
It doesn't harm the functionality as a whole. How those TIF dollars would be used would have to be consistent with the TIRZ project and financing plan, and we go through the traditional public infrastructure, and then there would be the ability to do 380s within there, and that would have to be individual applications that come to the overall TIF, but conceivably, I mean, you could do that. I mean, you can create zones within the overall TIRZ. My recommendation is to keep it simple, stupid, because if we can't lay it out in the overall plan, that it's going to be hard to implement. And I do say that but if there is some area that needs some specific attention, there's no harm to the overall TIF, because it goes back to my original premise that as a project generates, it's performance based. So if you're producing more taxes, you're getting more benefit that comes back to you, but you control your own destiny.
Okay, here's a question. If you have a low-income area adjacent to the zone that we've looked at, and you include them in the TIF, and it's residential, virtually no commercial, do you then risk gentrification in that area? Does it give people the potential to come in and buy homes and do things commercially?
I'm going to say yes, because the idea is that that's why we would say exclude it from the TIRZ if it was residential, and typically if it's a hot topic like that, we just draw around it, but as changing economics, those things happen, and that's just the natural course of any renaissance or revitalization, is that higher prices, and so you have to look at overall housing policies and
but the reality is moving the boundary around them doesn't incentivize gentrification any more than not having them there, because the zone is currently residential, so commercial wouldn't come in. So to his point, if we leave the boundary adjacent to them, there's just as much incentive to go in and buy up the property as not, because a developer is going to see that's right near where they're targeting for redevelopment anyway, so that's a prime opportunity. So the boundary,
I get what you're saying is the adjacency issue. This becomes a zoning issue,
right?
And TIFs are specifically not addressing zoning. It's about everybody's paying their same amount of taxes, and so as there's increment that occurs, those are being reinvested in the area. Those are policy decisions that I think have to be made about what an area and how it's going to be built, and that's why I try to avoid zoning because it's not linear in my mind.
So not to get him bogged down, can I contact you later about the keep it simple, stupid part of what I'm suggesting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sure.
That's
Okay.
what I would do.
What are the questions that we have? We're running a little short on time. We got a little bit.
Just a clarification, when we talk about TIF, we're talking about the tool that sets this up. When we say TIRZ, we're talking about the zoning area.
The zone.
itself,
The
not
zone.
It's
zoning.
called a tax increment reinvestment zone pursuant to the statute.
So you
Okay.
can use the TIF model to create several TIRZs
TIRZ.
within your community.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
I just got one last little thing, and it's more of a, again, I'll end up, if I can, I'd like to call you about it, but basically the spreadsheets that I asked for.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I got them, that's great. And I couldn't tell exactly if where the numbers that were in there got reported out to us, but each of the residential worksheet, the retail, not the retail one, the office worksheet, and the hotel worksheet, if you could double check for me the summary totals, the cells are adding in a weird way. it's giving our headwaters one credit for revenue that's coming out of the city, and it's kind of double dipping that. But I couldn't tell if those were actually being reported out to our summaries. So if they're not, great, but when I sell this to people, I need to be able to sell them with the numbers. So if you could just verify that that
and
backs
we'd be
up.
happy to walk you through
Yeah.
because it simply is an Excel sheet that has the inputs,
Yeah.
and then we have individual, because we get into these mix of uses. I
Right.
wish everything was just simple,
Yeah.
but we have to put it in residential, commercial,
Right.
and all of that feeds back to the output page, which you saw.
Right.
Okay, and so some of those other pages are important calculations, but they're not the final determination of what goes into the output page.
Right.
They just show you kind of how the increment's there.
Yeah.
And so I'd be happy to walk you through
Yeah.
A plus B equals C. This is how we got to this number.
Yeah, and just prove it up that that mistake that I'm seeing here didn't actually come into the output, because I don't think it did, but there's something in there, and I'll show it to you.
Okay, absolutely.
Just one last thing, David, you indicated that you're very close to the Bass Brothers. And some of the Basses have land out at Hunt. Do you think they might be interested in reinvesting in downtown Kerrville? Never mind.
No. But let me tell you that. My first job, I was working for the City of San Antonio Economic Development Department, and I got a call from a gentleman named Bill Baker, who was the lieutenant for Ed Bass, and said, "We're looking for somebody to manage our downtown TIF." And your name came up, and I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I don't know who these Basses are." And he goes, "Let me put you a little brochure together." And he sent it to me, and I was living in the Blue Star brewery lofts down there working for the city. And then I got this in the Wall Street Journal with the pencil sketch. And I've had a long relationship with them for the past 20 years, and we've done a lot of projects together. We just did a Buc-ee's with the Tanger Outlet up in Fort Worth. I've worked with them in Bentonville, Arkansas. In downtown, I've worked with them in Rockport. They own significant portions of property down there. So, and I've
Well,
worked
talk
with,
to them about how
So you
wonderful
could talk to
Kerrville.
and all that to say is that, and I've helped them in Round Rock. They did the La Frontera development there. So, never say never. I'd be happy to bring it up.
Good.
All right.
Thank you,
I
Natalie.
got one little brief thing before you, because we keep talking about them. You've explained it once. I don't really know. I don't really understand facade lease. Tell me what that's doing.
The facade lease, I would say, is now for all practical purposes obsolete.
Okay.
Because we have the 380 program, but
Okay.
prior to having the 380, so I'm going to give you a specific project.
Okay.
We had the Ashton Hotel, which was the original Fort Worth Club, and they wanted to convert it into 44 hotel units. And it's a wonderful hotel if you ever come to downtown Fort Worth. But there was no way we could give them, and they're investing millions of dollars, there's no way we could give them money under the TIF statute.
Oh, okay.
So what we did was we did a 10-year facade lease because it's a historic facade, and we paid them $80,000 a year for 10 years, up to $800,000. And so that was a way that we
So
could
you
fund.
created a lease to give them money.
Correct. And
do
the nature of it was you're leasing a historic facade and protecting it.
Okay.
Now with the 380, we could just give them a 380 grant to help them narrow
Okay,
that gap.
so it's one less hoop you got to jump through. Is that what
That's
you're
why I'm saying I really
Okay.
like the 380.
Okay. All right.
All right.
you very much.
11:55, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very thorough.